everyone. My name is June Kohler. I'm an assistant curator here at the Schnitzer Museum of Art, and it is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Robison to you this afternoon. She comes to us from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, where she got her degrees in art history and photography. That has sort of morphed into her degree here. She's getting her master's degree at the University of Oregon in the art history department, and her specialty is on post-war Italian photography and cinema. She's writing her thesis on Mario Giacomelli and neorealism film, which I will be very excited to read your thesis. Sounds scintillating. I had the pleasure of working with her on this exhibition. As I said, her specialty is post-war Italian art. She's an intern here at the museum and actually approached me about being involved, which I was very grateful for. She produced all of the interpretive material for this show and actually supervised all of the design and layout when I was away on a business trip. So I'm very, very thankful to her. The show would not have happened without her. But without any further ado, I'll let her give you a wonderful talk about these pieces. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So I'm going to kind of follow the way that I wrote the introductory panel for this exhibition. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of the biography and work into Piero Dorazio's style and then exactly this exhibition, what we have going on here. Because his biography is so interesting and so fun, and it really can't be divorced from his personal style as an artist. So I thought I would kind of start there. Sorry, you guys having trouble? Are you okay? Okay. So Piero Dorazio, he was born on June 29th, 1927 in Rome, Italy. And it's really important at this time to note what was going on in art in Italy. And so in 1927, this was during the kind of fascist era, and there was really a major control over the arts. And they were very unsupportive of abstract art at this time. And there was also a real control over the international art circulation. And so artists in Italy and just the general community in Italy really didn't have the access to international modern art movements that were happening at that time. And so it was only when Dorazio was about 18, late teens, early 20s, that he finally got sort of this access to an international art education. But even as he was growing up, he was very interested in drawing, and so that kind of led him to a university degree, at least pursuing a university degree at the University of Rome in architecture. And he did this for about 4 years before he finally decided to quit and pursue painting instead. But this architectural background really informed the linear elements that we see. Obviously, you can see it all around in his work in here. And so at this time, when he decided to drop out of the university, he really became more involved in sort of modern art circles and kind of the young art movement in Italy at this time. This was about 1945 to 1950 that he started to do this with some of his friends, all working towards the modern art promotion in Italy. And so he began starting to write art criticism. He began just trying to educate the public about international art and especially abstract art, which was so highly kind of kept secret at the time from the public. And so at this time, he and his friends co-founded the important group Forma in 1947. And this group was very much about promoting abstract art to the public. And they thought of it as really a kind of in the post-war Italian spirit, really the freedom of, access. And one of the quotes from their manifesto, they actually wrote a whole manifesto, which is very modern in its design too. It's very, like the Forma 1 design goes along the side, and there are very square linear elements throughout the whole thing, so that's kind of interesting. But one of the quotes from this says, "The progressive elements in our society have to maintain a revolutionary and avant-garde position." So they really thought of themselves as kind of a avant-garde progressing towards this new freedom in Italy. And so that's kind of where the Forma 1 group was growing and where his art, very kind of a social freedom was also going at this time. He was extremely political in his youth, which kind of feeds into all of his later work as well. And so at this time, he also won a scholarship to the École des Beaux-Arts. Excuse me, I don't speak French, I speak Italian. But in Paris. I'm sorry, what?
École des Beaux-Arts.
Thank you. Yes, École des Beaux-Arts in 1947. And so he went to study in Paris for a year. And this really allowed him access to the French art scene that he had never experienced before. And at this time, he began meeting some of the most famous artists in the French art scene as well, such as Georges Braque, Hans Arp, Le Corbusier, Sonia Delaunay, among many other names. And one of the big things about Dorazio is that he is notable for having such great connections in the international art world throughout his entire lifetime, starting in the late 40s, early 50s when he starts to travel. And in this way, he kind of was the best connection of the international art world to Italy. And so he met all of these people, and then he came back to Italy, and he continued trying to promote modern and abstract art in Italy. And in 1950, he co-founded it's a cooperative gallery, I guess you could say. It's a gallery/bookstore, technically, which comes into play a little bit later when we're talking about prints. But it was called L'Age d'Or, and in this gallery, it was kind of the only space in Rome, really, for international artists to come and show their work at this time. And so they had a lot of really amazing exhibitions. Robert Rauschenberg was one of the most notable ones. And kind of at this time, he's already traveled to France, and in 1953, he is offered a position to teach at Harvard University for a summer course. So he goes to Harvard, and he meets all of the kind of United States international art scene at this time, the most famous names in modern abstract art, such as Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell. He even met Jackson Pollock and Clement Greenberg, and he became friends with all of these people, and so all of their styles kind of begin to influence his style, and then he brought all of their movements sort of back to Italy in 1955. And this time he published the first modern art book, I guess you could say, to appear in Italy, and it was called La Fantasia Dell-Arte Nella Vita Moderna. And this kind of follows in a little bit with everything that he had experienced before. So this kind of political freedom in Italy at the time, the freedom of abstract art to come in, and the notion of the universal style of abstraction to create more of a unified world. And so this was a really big deal in Italy. And then from there, I mean, he goes on to show all over the place. He was very, very popular in the 1950s, the 1960s, and all the way up until he passed away in 2005. And so some of the big things that he did, he was a part of several of the Venice Biennales, and he was even a curator of one of the Venice Biennales as well. And also, from 1960 to 1969, he taught at the Graduate School of Fine Arts at the University of Pennsylvania. And so he did spend a good chunk of his time in the United States before returning to Italy later on in his life. Let's see. Oh, and also one of his most influential, I guess, group exhibitions, and where the title of this exhibition comes from, is a 1965 exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called The Responsive Eye. And this exhibition was very, very, very popular for its time. It was very avant-garde in itself. And the whole exhibition was basically based on the theme of art or optical art. And so it was interesting because it was something that the public had never seen before. And it was a really big deal. There's actually, there are some really great videos on YouTube if you want to see the public reaction to this. They're pretty funny. They interview people as they go through the galleries. And some of them absolutely love it, and they think it's great. They think it's the hottest new thing in modern art, and some of them absolutely hated it. And they just think it's very disturbing. They don't know how to look at it, how to understand it. And the critics thought exactly the same way as well. Some critics loved it, some critics really hated it. But this kind of controversy caused the responsive eye exhibit to be extremely popular in contemporary culture. And there was even a fashion magazine, I think it might have been Vogue, but I can't remember right now which one it was. But they dressed up all of their fashion models in outfits that matched the works in the gallery, and it shot them with their corresponding work and published it in the magazine. So it became kind of a popular culture fashion thing. But then the issue with that was that optical art at that time, and even still kind of today, was kind of seen as sort of less serious type of art, a little bit less academic, but I mean, that's just some take on it. I certainly don't agree with that. I think there is plenty of science involved in optical art, and obviously the creation of optical effects is a very difficult thing to do if you're an artist. But that's still one of the barriers that they're kind of dealing with in terms of optical art as a fine art. All right, so in terms of optical art and the responsive eye, that is exactly what this exhibition is trying to show us, how Dorazio's works act as optical art. And optical art is interesting because it plays with notions of composition, notions of color juxtapositions that are kind of, it's not really a scientific thing, it's more of a perceptual thing for us about how our eyes are able to understand certain nuances in forms and shades of color and how they interact. And so that's what we have going on here. But also, I talked about it a lot with his meeting of other artists and his influence in the international art community. These are not just op art kind of abstractions. The history of Dorazio's work comes from a long line of art history influences. So in his initial works, as he was kind of an architect, he was very into linear drawings, very much more detailed, I guess I could say. A lot of that comes from his combination of architecture and also a combination of an interest in cubism. We can also see it, especially in these works here, an influence of cubism. And also, there was an interest in, especially the fact that he was Italian, in futurism. And actually, Dorazio was kind of credited with coming up with, or not really coming up with, but kind of rediscovering the futurist movement in the post-war period, because they had been largely kind of taken out of the spotlight by the whole program of Mussolini and the fascists, and not really enjoying abstract art because it went against their causes. And so he kind of rediscovered futurism a little bit for the rest of Italy, and then kind of uses a lot of the elements, the dynamic line movement, which you can obviously see in a lot of these works, and even some kind of color experiments that the futurists did influence his work as well. And also there's a really big influence of constructivism in Piero Dorazio's works. And this was a Russian movement really focusing on the social implications of art as a betterment for society. And so in this way, Dorazio is really kind of against the whole notion of art for art's sake that a lot of the abstract expressionists and sort of American abstract artists kind of promoted. So though we may kind of associate his style with a lot of these things, the actual meanings and history behind Dorazio's work is a lot more complicated than what we would assume. And then, of course, we have the more obvious associations of the optical art influence from the 1960s and the color-filled paintings that were very popular at this time as well in American abstract art. Mark Rothko is a huge influence on Dorazio's works, as I assume many of you can guess from looking at these. And also, one of the interesting things about Dorazio is that he was very influenced by Vasily Kandinsky's concerning the spiritual in art. And so a lot of these works are not just supposed to be visual abstractions, but they're really supposed to communicate something more, something kind of about the immaterial nature of art, but at the same time a combination, an interesting one, of the social implications of art as a betterment for society. So it's kind of an interesting notion of duality that plays in all of Dorazio's work, even beginning with the social implications of betterment to, a personal reaction to immateriality in art. All right, so how is this exhibition organized? Let's just talk about this. So it's basically a progression of trying to organize things based on composition. And so what we have right behind you guys, I know the camera can't see it, but it's generally organized by kind of a line thickness first. So we move with the thicker lines here, and these are very kind of horizontally oriented, kind of almost heavy through the thick lines. Yeah, you can take a seat. And then over here on this right wall, we have kind of a medium line width, and these all kind of have the same overlapping of the lines where they break, and you have this kind of aberration of color right here. And then over here, we have kind of an even thinner line width if you're looking at, say, like these lines or these lines here. But the real notion right here is the grid organization, as you can kind of see through all of the square patterns. And finally, over here, we have the thinnest lines, all a little bit more complete lines than what we're seeing in the breaks throughout all of these. And definitely the notion of kind of this wavy freeform pattern. We even have a spiral in this one. So that's kind of what's going on here. And then actually, if you look at this piece, it has similar kind of breaks in the lines between color that speak to that piece on the top up there with the break in the lines and the pieces over here as well. So it does kind of flow in a circular motion, but the pieces all kind of talk to each other. And obviously they're all very similar for their, the white background with the vibrant pops of color in the graphic areas.
Are these simultaneous in terms of chronology, or is there a mixture there? Or?
It's a little bit of a mixture. I think the pieces date from about 1966, some of them, 67, 68, and 69. But they're a little bit disorganized in terms of date. They're really more organized in terms of composition. And that kind of works okay for Dorazio's work because a lot of his pieces recreate the same compositions. It's kind of a series of compositional experiments, with the same pieces over and over again.
The process?
I'm getting there. I'm going to do that. Yeah, definitely. I guess we can do that now. So Dorazio is really most well known as a painter. And if you go to major museums around the country, if they have large collections of Dorazio's, they will probably most certainly have paintings of his. I know the Guggenheim has a fantastic collection of his work. And so what's interesting is we have a whole collection of prints here. And so how are we going to read Dorazio's prints versus his paintings? And I've read a few interviews of Dorazio, and he speaks to this quite a bit. They asked him, why did you start doing lithographs, which is what the majority of these prints are? The only prints there are a couple of aquatints, and those are this one on the far left, and these three on the far right. And then that center one is a lithograph. So that's actually a good place to look to compare the two. And then what Dorazio ended up saying about his choice to do lithography was that the medium didn't necessarily matter. It does matter. He's very interested in kind of the fight of the artist against the medium. And so he thinks that the medium is something to be tackled to kind of get what you're saying. But that's why the medium can kind of change. He was also a sculptor. He was also a ceramicist. But in terms of printmaking, he didn't see anything wrong with transferring what he had been doing in painting to printmaking and to lithography. which, I mean, at this time, lithography was kind of seen as sort of a lesser, lower art. It's the primary form for printing books. But I mean, at the same time as that, the Age d'Or Gallery, I told you, was also kind of a cooperative bookstore. And so he was interested in this kind of book print culture as sort of a form of dissemination. And so that's why he actually did do quite a bit of lithographs and aquatints, engravings, all of that stuff. And the difference between a lithograph and an aquatint, visually you can see it, especially with these pieces here. The lithograph is, I'm going to say it's bolder in color. The colors are kind of more saturated in a way. I mean, they are the same colors, but they tend to stand on top of the paper a little bit more. And that is by the printing process. Lithographs are produced by either a plate or a stone having a chemical process they use water, and so it kind of, the negative areas are repelled and the positive areas stick to the paper in the ink. It's kind of a complicated process to explain. But whereas the aquatints are kind of a version of etching, it's also a chemical process, but in this case, the drawing, or whatever the lines here in this case, are literally chemically etched into a metal plate, whereby the ink is soaked up into that plate and then imprinted. So the ink, I think, tends to saturate the paper a little bit more in an aquatint, and if you get really, really close, you can see textural differences, whereas this has a little bit more of a, I don't know if you want to call it maybe a velvety texture. It feels like if you would touch it, it would be a little bit more tactile versus the lithographs, which are extremely smooth. So that's just kind of a little technical note going on there. But I mean, if you look at them, they tend to kind of function the same, and this was kind of Dorazio's hope that he could produce works in his same style in various different kinds of media. Let's see. Oh, and also kind of an interesting story about his introduction to lithography. He first discovered lithography. He went to Nice in France, and he somehow found the lithographic studio where Matisse had originally done a lot of his prints, and he got to see the lithographic plates and stones that Matisse had used, and he's like, this is fantastic, I have to do this, and he went through all of the training to learn how to do lithography. So that's kind of funny. All right, so also in terms of these works, we talked about how they all don't have, well, they all have dates, but they're not necessarily chronological, but these works are also untitled, which is kind of uncharacteristic of a lot of Dorazio's work. Most of his works were titled, especially the paintings, they were all titled. And the titles are really fun and really kind of speak to what Dorazio wants you to get out of these works. And so, to give you an example, I've found titles of paintings that are in very similar compositions to some of the prints that we have here to show you what they might have been titled in their painting form. So this piece right here is very similar to some paintings that were titled Casimir, and this is in relation to Kazimir Malevich, who was the Russian constructivist, sort of suprematist, painted these square compositions. So all of the square compositions, or at least several of them, are titled Casimir. So that's kind of funny. But then at the same time, you have things like Parallela is a title for one, and so that would be something a little bit more like this piece over here, where the lines literally are just kind of parallel. And there are also kind of more emotional titles. There's one piece called Diffuse Passion, which is a very large yellow piece, yellow gold, with little tiny hints of red, and so that's kind of where the diffuse passion aspect of that is supposed to come in. Yeah. And then finally, there are a lot of titles that relate to the movements of the pieces. And so there are titles called Balance and Counterbalance. I don't know if we have any in here particularly. Maybe the diagonal piece would be kind of an example, but and so that's talking about where the lines seem to balance and then literally counterbalance in the picture. And then there are even more humorous ones. There's one series of very, very complex, tiny little lined paintings, and their title is Poorly Understood Course, because you literally can't get through the mesh of lines. So that's kind of a note on titles. All right. Oh, and also interestingly, in terms of titles, sometimes works that are similar in composition, say there are two works, let's see, I think it's this piece. There are two paintings that look very similar to this piece, and one is titled Of May, as in relating to the month of May, and the other one that looks almost exactly like it is titled Obedient Phoenix. So, he was very fluid in titling his pieces. I think it might have just been what he was kind of feeling when he painted it at the time, what he was picturing, and maybe what certain things can kind of speak about, if they can speak about more than one thing, such as possibly a work like that one. All right, so there's also, we've talked about a little bit of the similarities in a lot of these works, but there are also a lot of differences that we can see even in the compositions here. And these run through Dorazio's entire Ove, kind of the variations. I talked a lot about duality earlier. And duality is really it's really the major theme in Dorazio's work, I think. And so, first of all, we have movement. And when we're talking about optical art, you can't not talk about movement. And so if you look at these pieces right behind you guys, I'm sorry, you can't see it. But the movement here is really kind of static. The lines are big, they're heavy. Even at the one on the top, it's placed so that the big heavy bars almost seem to be falling down, and you feel this kind of weight pressing down. And especially down in the corner of this one, you see that kind of dark blue or black, you can't quite tell, I think it's dark blue, square that really kind of holds your eye down there in the bottom of the composition. But then you get to pieces like these, and the movement here is a lot lighter. And it's just simply because of the line width. And so these pieces have kind of a stacking, overlapping, sort of fluid quality, even though this piece in the center and the piece on the sides are still completely rectilinear instead of the curving forms that we see maybe in these two pieces here or this piece right here. And one really funny thing about this big piece in the middle, while we were installing it, it took us about half an hour to get the piece to level, because if you look at it, this right side is really white and really off balance, and so we could not figure out why the piece looked like it was falling over this way. And it turned out it was level, it just has that kind of appearance of falling off. All right, and then in terms of these pieces, we definitely have more of a grid layout going on here, but it's really fascinating because, especially here, you can't really tell which square is which, and the squares kind of begin to overlap. And so the grid kind of shifts and moves. There might be a grid in front of us, and then there might be a grid behind that. And so there's kind of an overlapping of layers and of planes going on in these pieces. And then this piece right here in the top, it's really interesting because you have these tiny little lines of white going along in the middle. And so the bars kind of vibrate a little bit if you look at it. And so it's especially interesting because like this bar of white and this bar of white are different widths. And so it's kind of hard to tell how they're spaced out. And you want to kind of like visually squish them in the right spots so that they're all orderly, but you can't. And then in this one down here, if you look at it, it kind of looks a little bit like plaid, I think anyway. Kind of got the overlapping. Argyle, yeah, a little bit. But then if you look at it, you've got this kind of break in the textures of these big squares. And so he's trying to speak a little bit more to the surfaces going on here. And then it also kind of speaks a little bit to the background, because if you look at it, what's in the center of this picture, and it's these two little white dots here. So it's actually the background that's kind of popping out at us, also as a kind of form, the same shape as these squares here. Yeah. And then in this piece, it's also trying to play with our minds a little bit. So you've got some squares that are static and straight. It's even a little bit hard to tell. I think this square is probably straight and this green one, but then other squares are tilted just off center so that it's hard to tell which squares are straight and which ones are kind of tilted. And the whole thing kind of appears to be sort of jumbling a little bit, like you could shake it and they would move around. And then these pieces, obviously you have the spiral movements going on, you've got the overlapping waves. And one of the interesting things about Dorazio's works, a lot of the times they say that the lines can sort of extend out into infinity, as if they would just keep going and keep moving. And even in the spiral, you can imagine that these would just continue to spiral out. Yeah. Now let's see. Also, we've definitely got movement down, but in terms of color, they also kind of are very strategic. Dorazio was always very strategic in his use of color. And so the colors are placed so that they will vibrate. And this kind of visual vibration it's a sensation where colors, especially complementary colors like the blues and the yellows, or blues and oranges, purples and yellows, reds and greens, are placed so that they will intensify each other, and it makes the whole thing kind of pop out at us. And so there are areas, especially, you can see it in this one, where complementary colors are intentionally placed in the same bar to make them kind of play off of one another. So you've got the red and the green bar there, and then you've got the blue and the yellow bar, and the orange and the purple bar. So he's not just placing colors kind of randomly. These are very strategically thought out. And then we also have the notion of color layering and color mixing. And when he paints, Dorazio painted in a lot of series of glazes. And so in these prints, he's trying to recreate that idea of glazing in very, very thin layers of paint. You can definitely see it here in these, how the layers allow you to see what's underneath. And even in this one, you can also see how this green stripe goes over, say, like the yellow and the maroon, to see what's underneath of that. And one of the big things about Dorazio's use of color was that he was really trying to derive his colors from natural sources. And one of the interesting things in a lot of his paintings that you don't necessarily get in a lot of these works is that Dorazio didn't just paint on a white background at all. A lot of the backgrounds were actually colored. And so you would there's one pair of paintings that I remember that is supposed to speak to night and day. And so one of the paintings is painted on a black background with kind of small swirling colors. And then the same painting is painted on a red background. And so the dark one is night and the red background is day. And also one of the things that you get a lot in other Dorazio works, instead of a white background, sometimes he would use pink. And he said that pink was kind of the color of daylight. And so he was trying to let the daylight kind of shine through in the back of his works. So I thought that was pretty cool. All right. And in terms of light and daylight, we've kind of mentioned that a little bit, but light is a huge factor in these works. And there's kind of a creation of the color forms as sort of light in themselves. And this kind of goes back a little bit too to the opticality of the works, because obviously color derives from light. And so what a lot of these works do, they appear to mix color as if a color would be mixed in light. So if you get especially like these works here, you can imagine them almost as kind of like colorful spotlights, and that would be how the light would mix through their transparency. And also you've got kind of the lightness too of the background. I talked about that with the daylight being the pink in the background. There is definitely a lightness felt in all of the white in the background in these works. All right. And also one of the other things that's interesting is the creation of form in these works. It's not necessarily the usual kind of light versus shadow, because if you look at these, there really are no shadows. Dorazio doesn't paint shadows for us at all, but in our mind, we can imagine them. And so the colors themselves, the ones in the back, or even sometimes the ones more in the front, can become three-dimensional for us. They can create shadows in our minds. And I think that's especially prevalent here, because we feel like certain ones are creating a shadow on the ones behind them. But there's no shadow at all. It's kind of playing a trick on our eyes. All right. And finally, one of the big things with Dorazio's work is the reason that he does all of this, essentially, is to kind of convey emotions to us. And this is where his work is really speaking with works like Mark Rothko, where he uses color to speak to certain emotions. But there's a real difference in Dorazio's work, because Rothko's works are kind of somber. If you all know Mark Rothko, they're very somber. But these are trying to do something very different. They're trying to be happy. They're really trying to show joy and to show freedom and to show life. And let's see. And yeah, this notion of life and everyday life is really kind of what he's trying to get at here. And so it's using the colors of nature to show us that we can experience, different things personally. And so I can look at these works and I can pick a favorite one because I like these colors or that color. But it also gives us an emotion, like with the one that was called, Diffuse Passion, can definitely display us an emotion similar to what we might see in a Rothko work. But the vibrancy here really makes it bright and alive. And so really his paintings act as kind of a modern interpretation to the world of kind of exploring the spirit of the age through color. And so he really wants you to, or at least wanted you to, experience these works not only on a personal level of your emotional reactions, but also react to the modern world around you and just your everyday experience of passing time. So I think that's about it. If you have any questions, yeah.
In your research, did you ever hear Joseph Alvarez's name?
Yes, definitely, of course. The squares.
And
Yeah.
Did Dorazio consider himself a colorist?
Dorazio? He did consider himself a colorist, but in a little bit of a different way. And so I know especially in like a Jackson Pollock painting, Pollock really considered himself as part of the painting. Whereas Dorazio thought color he used it as a tool. And so he was very divorced from his paintings. You can't see his brushstrokes, obviously, because these are prints. But even in the paintings, he tried to keep his hand out of it and kind of divorce himself a little bit personally from the work. And so color for him was a tool to kind of get you to think about certain things, kind of trigger. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you remind us about the extent and meaning of futurism?
The extent of futurism and the meaning of it?
Was it mainly an Italian?
Yeah, definitely. It was mainly Italian. There were other kind of offshoots. There was a little bit of a Russian futurist offshoot. But basically, they were they were a modernist art group, so after World War I, essentially pre-World War II. And they were an extremely aggressive, male-dominated group. And they were very into the notion of force and of kind of the new technology, and so they were really into cars, but all of this kind of in their artwork was displayed in sort of like an aggressive movement, an emphasis on movement.
Literary component to it?
Yes, definitely. Okay. Yeah, there was actually a whole futurist manifesto, which is fascinating to read if you have the time. It's extremely aggressive in its language, though, of the promotion of like this powerful force of art. Yeah.
Do you know how they came to the museum? I see here they're all a gift of Stephen Shaki. I don't know who he was or what the story is there.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I know the museum does own these pieces.
It was in 79.
Yeah. So they've been here quite a while. Yeah.
And there's a lot more.
Yeah, there are several more. June would actually know more. I didn't get to choose the pieces that were in the show. They were already chosen by the time that I started working on it. But there are several more here.
Really
yeah.
It helps that you gave us a real overview of his
of the different artists that he hung out with.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know when I look at some of those over there, I really see the influence of Kandinsky and those shapes,
Yeah,
those
definitely.
lines and those colors. And then in thinking in terms of like how you would work with these on a tour, those are, to my eye, those are very much like fabric pieces.
Yeah.
With the overlaid colors, you know, and I think that a lot could be done with this exhibit.
I think so too.
You know, a lot of different approaches could be used to get people engaged.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Because
I wish we had more too, because this is only a very small example of Dorazio's work and of his styles, and they're so multifaceted in that way. They speak to so many different movements in art history too. That it's really fun. It's great.
Well, thank you for taking us there, because you know, I've never seen this before. They were just tucked away.
Yeah.
Did you say he was influenced by Matisse?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, the color collages of Matisse, kind of the Fauvist. Yeah.
Some of these.
Yeah.
Yeah, the paper.
Yeah, and he actually, and one of the mediums that he did use was a color collage, and so he made paper collages very similar, literally taking colored pieces of paper and putting them together in this same sort of format and other formats.
Kind of remind me of like a tissue work.
Yeah, and he also did that. Yeah, so a lot of anything that you could think of that is done with this form, he probably experimented with it at some point.
The grid one, I wonder where historically in time Mondrian came.
Yeah, there's definitely the influence of that as well.
Like the same period?
Oh no, Mondrian was much more before that. But I'm gonna say 1910s, 1920s. Yeah. But all of that does come into play. He knows his art history for sure. Yeah, because he's picking different ones, and he's like, I'm going to try Cubism today, and I'm going to try Futurism today, and I'm going to try Fauvism tomorrow, and
So did he do any representational or figurist or landscape-ish?
Not in any of the works that he would consider his oeuvre, like his major work. He did do some illustrations for books, for different books. I can't remember what they were right now, but
It's interesting, for example, when you look at Mark Rothko and kind of the arc of his career, where he was doing the almost surrealistic sorts of things before he got into the colorist or color field arena.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about Dorazio's work is this kind of firm hold to abstraction the entire time that he's working, from 1945 all the way up to 2005. And this style that we see here kind of begins in sort of the 1960s, and it really predominates his work for a long time. It keeps coming back and back. It never goes away. So, yeah. It's interesting to see how many times he can recreate a very similar style. Yeah.
There's a children's literature artist named Leo Leoni. And when I first walked in here, it just reminded me of like his Pezzatino and some of his other books. And he was Italian, but he was considered himself a graphic artist.
Oh, okay.
And then he went on to lots of collages and colors and overlapping. And so I can't wait to go look at them again.
Yeah, compare. Yeah.
And see their age and
Yeah. All right. Well, you have any other questions?
Thank you. You did a great job.
Oh, thank you so much.
I have so much more response to this after your comments than before your comments.
Yeah, there's so much history that isn't necessarily visible on the surface of these.
You were so comprehensive.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I always loved walking through here once they put it up. weeks ago, maybe? I don't know.
Several weeks ago. Yeah, it's been up a while.
And the elevator's right there. You can't miss it.
And I think it's actually kind of funny too, because you've got this room of like the very Baroque, and then you walk in here and it's like, bam. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, after the talk, they kind of all go together. So I said they kind of, it speaks to everything in the museum. So
This whole area is in the canon.
That's correct.
So there's kind of both European.
It's all European in here, actually. And about the aquatints, too, your description was fantastic, but you can really see it in the Goya pieces that we have on view in the south of the canon. And aquatint was a revolutionary process that happened in, I believe, the 18th century?
I think so.
17th, maybe?
yeah.
But it was the first time that you could really get these velvety gradations that Sarah was talking about. And Goya was definitely a master of aquatint, so I encourage you to wander down there and see the difference between you know, how the process developed from when Goya was making it popular to when Dorazio was doing much different pop things.
Yeah.
Is this the lithography? Is that what causes the little bit of bleeding in the edges, or did he do that intentionally?
That's probably from the plate squishing. There was probably just a little bit too much ink on the plate.
And I think it sort of adds to it, you know?
It really does. And another interesting point about the lithography too is that these lines are much crisper.
Oh,
You
yeah.
get this almost bleeding effect with the aquatint.
Yeah.
And again, that's because of the chemical process and sort of the thinning of the inks. But
All right. Yeah, thank you all.